I want to express my appreciation for all of you who have gotten up so early after undoubtedly carousing here in Las Vegas late last night. I especially want to express my appreciation for those of you who are fathers, who are here today listening to a talk on remote viewing instead of spending the time with your family. I'm a father too, and I appreciate having this time with you. And I want to express some appreciation as well to Las Vegas itself. My wife and I moved here 3 months ago. And we're thrilled to be in Las Vegas, and I'm thrilled to be able to welcome you to the city of Las Vegas. And it's a beautiful day today. You know, it's June. And I'd like to begin my talk with a little poem. I'm going to end with a poem as well. I'm sure many of you have heard this one. What is so rare as a day in June? Then if ever come perfect days. Then heaven asks earth if it be in tune. And over it softly her warm ear lays. Whether we look or whether we listen, we hear life murmur and see it glisten. And you know, since I've moved to Las Vegas, what I do every morning now, I'm getting up at 5 o'clock and going out into the desert and taking a long run in the desert. And I go into a state of mind that Ed Mitchell described last night, sort of when he was out on the moon looking back at the earth, a state of awe. Because when I'm out in the desert, I can look around me and there's shale. And if I look closely in the shale, I'll see fossils going back to the Cambrian period, 400 million years ago, before the very first vertebrates were here. This was the floor of a primeval ocean. And the trilobites and mollusks are some of our oldest ancestors have left their remains for us to see. And I'm sort of amazed when I think that the very same process that created those trilobites also created this casino and the Strip in Las Vegas and these hotels. And I think there's a paradox in that. And ironically, I believe that that very paradox is associated with my topic today. Does remote viewing work? And let me jump ahead so that there are no surprises. I'll tell you the answer. Yes, remote viewing works, but we've got to pay attention to a number of paradoxes. We have to be appreciative of paradox. For example, why is it that one of the most popular recent books on the subject of remote viewing warns that there's a real danger you might go crazy from doing remote viewing? And why is it that another one of the recent bestsellers in the field talks about how you can use scientific remote viewing to experience the living reality of Jesus Christ? Makes you think maybe the first guy is right. You can go crazy. Why is it that Joe McMoneagle received a congressional medal for his work doing remote viewing for the CIA and other military intelligence programs? And then a few years later, the CIA shut the programs down with a public announcement that they never really worked in the first place. Why, for example, on 2 occasions did Russell Targ do and report some exciting studies using remote viewing to forecast silver futures, getting 9 hits in a row, followed by subsequent trials that yielded results of 9 misses in a row? Why do so many spiritual traditions warn against the cultivation and display of psychic abilities like remote viewing. And yet at the same time, every one of those traditions is based upon psychic experience. Why is it that the great archetypal myth of Western culture is about the sage, the healer, who gets crucified? Why is it said that a prophet is never believed in his own country? And how about the great Greek myth of prophecy, the myth of Cassandra, in which Cassandra asked the gods for the vision of the future, and the gods said, sure, no problem, but we have one condition. Nobody will believe you. And why is it that William James, 100 years ago, America's greatest psychologist who made enormous contributions to parapsychology, then called psychical research, most of which are unrecognized in the mainstream psychological establishment, why did he say that we have to measure progress in this field by the half century and century instead of by the decade, as in other scientific disciplines? Why is it that 20 years after I got my doctoral degree in parapsychology from UC Berkeley and wrote a dissertation called Psi Development Systems, that UC Berkeley hasn't offered another single graduate degree in that field? Which for me, I think, is a source of personal sadness and motivation. How is it that the same process that produces the trilobites on the desert floor here has also produced the casinos? We have to be open to paradoxes. Now, many of you come from a tradition in which words like controlled remote viewing, technical remote viewing, scientific remote viewing are second nature. In fact, I gather from some of the speakers that there's no other way to think about it. Oh, I forgot one other paradox, and maybe it's the most important of all, because our opening speaker seemed very clear, almost axiomatic, that one of the basic truths about remote viewing is that it is trainable, that it can be trained. And yet yesterday morning speaker, 24 hours ago, Dean Radin, stood at this lectern and presented a massive study with thousands of remote viewing trials that showed no significant difference between the people who had taken the many different remote viewing training courses and people who hadn't had training at all. It's a paradox. And especially in the context of this talk, one that we should be very mindful of. Now, when I first learned about remote viewing, I remember the day quite well, in February 1976, when Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff had invited me to visit them at SRI and see what they were doing. And they said, well, the best way for you to learn remote viewing is we'll just let you be the remote viewer. And there's nothing to it. There was no rituals, no protocols. They just said, close your eyes and give yourself permission to obtain mental imagery. Hal Puthoff is going to go out somewhere and hide, and you get imagery about where he is. And Russell stayed with me in the sealed room, and I drew a picture. Looked like this. And I said, gee, it looks like a rack of clothing. Now, we now know about a term, I now know about a term that's often used, analytical overlay. And Russ and Hal were very familiar, and they said, well, let's look at your picture, and we won't pay too much attention to the fact that you think you were in a clothing store looking at a rack of clothing. And Hal came back, and he looked at the targets, and he said, oh, this is easy. I can match your drawing right away. It's a direct hit. It wasn't a rack of clothing at all. It was a pedestrian overpass. And that was that. I mean, that was my whole introduction to remote viewing. I was off and running. And I can say after hundreds of examples later and all sorts of experience in various training programs and testing programs, roughly my remote viewing abilities are about that good. They haven't improved much, to be honest. They haven't gotten much worse either. And I developed an idea back in 1976. Really, that meeting with Hal and Russ was inspirational for two reasons. My second book, Psi Development Systems, was really based on my inquiry into training remote viewing that came out of that meeting. My fourth book, which was just published, The PK Man, also was a result of that meeting. And it's just a sidebar. I won't say much about it, except at the time, Hal and Russ said, we've got this strange case here of a fellow who seems to be able to control the weather, and we're in enough trouble because we've been testing Uri Geller, and we don't want to jeopardize our funding. You're a young graduate student without a big career to ruin. Why don't you, why don't you take this case off of our hands? And 25 years later, The PK Man was published. I developed a theory that training psychic abilities, training remote viewing abilities, necessitated what I called a J-curve. That is, people initially, they're at one side of the J. They're going to show positive results. We see it as the beginner's effect. And Russell has told you he kept that program funded for nearly 20 years because every time a skeptical scientist with no experience came, he would have that scientist participate as a subject in remote viewing experiments. So we have good reason to think that people perform very well the first time around. And I suspected that what happened is that after that first experience, the reality of it all set in, and people began to get spooked for a variety of reasons, which I'll go into, and that the training process was a question of dealing with the fear. People are afraid of psi. Why is that? There are a number of reasons. If you go on the internet to the parapsychology FAQ, frequently asked questions, I've listed about 15 reasons why people are afraid of psychic functioning. But if I had to tell you in a nutshell what it's all about, it goes back for me to the day in 1973 when Arthur C. Clarke appeared on the Berkeley campus, right after he had been quoted in Time magazine as poo-pooing Uri Geller. And I was in the audience at the time, and he was speaking, and I raised my hand, and I said, "Mr. Clarke, do you believe in ESP?" And he looked at me, and he said, "No, I do not, because I don't want anybody to read my mind." And I began thinking about that and realizing what a profound truth he had said. You see, Sigmund Freud had written one of his greatest books, Civilization and Its Discontents, in which he said, in order to form a civilization, we have to teach people that certain impulses that are natural in their psyche are unacceptable, namely their sexual and aggressive urges. So according to Freud, we don't even want to know what's in our own mind. Civilization doesn't tolerate it. We repress our sexual and aggressive urges. That's how we create the Freudian unconscious. If we can't accept what's in our own mind, how can we bear to have anyone else know? And then other psychologists went even further. Carl Jung pointed out that not only do we repress our sexual and aggressive drives, we repress our spirituality. It's just as unacceptable. And many other aspects. In fact, you can take the whole system of yoga chakras and map it out against the different schools of Western psychology. But there are many other fears. Some people are simply afraid they'll be rejected, or afraid they're going to go crazy, or afraid that they're dabbling with the diabolic, afraid that they're going to lose their ego boundaries. In a way, these are all different expressions of the fear of the unconscious. But my theory as a graduate student was that if we could address these fears about remote viewing, then people would, their scores would drop after the initial success. But then they'd go back up and you'd get a J curve. And I actually, in the summer of 1977, set up a study. I had 10 students for 7 weeks and we tested them once a week. And then I did the standard psychological statistics, an F test, and I found, sure enough, there was a J curve in the data. It was significant at the 0.001 level, 1 in 1,000 probability. It looked like it would be a great dissertation until, lo and behold, I realized that neither I nor any of my esteemed academic advisors had taken into account a statistical problem peculiar to parapsychology called the stacking effect. And for those of you who may not know about it, I'll just tell you briefly. It is that if you're doing a trial in which you have 10 people or 30 people all viewing the same target, you cannot treat each of those viewings as statistically independent of each other. So I had to start my dissertation all over at that point. And that's another long story, and I don't want to go into that just now. Let me jump around a little bit and tell you about a person I worked with doing remote viewing years later, and it was a very significant experience for me. There he is. His name is Jeff Blank, and he came to work for me at the Intuition Network, the nonprofit organization of which I'm the president, and he came on as our executive administrator. He has a background in law, was a lawyer, never experienced anything psychic, anything remote, like remote viewing at all, had no inkling about it or no sense that he might ever have some abilities. But one evening, we were together at my house and we're having dinner, and I was talking to him about remote viewing, and he was a little curious, and I said, well, would you like to experience it? And he said, well, I guess. So I happened to have in the next room, in a sealed envelope, a postcard of a work of art. And that's all I knew about it. I said, there's a postcard, and it's a postcard of a work of art. This is it. It's in the other room. Why don't you just close your eyes and give yourself permission to obtain mental imagery about whatever is on that postcard. And this is exactly what he said, word for word. I wrote it down verbatim. He said, there is a tree on a small hill, a big tree with broad, expansive branches. There might be people under the tree, either a boy and a girl or a man and a woman. They look Victorian or old European. The woman or girl has a fluffy dress with It's white with bright edges ballooning out at the bottom. It covers her arms, but not her hands. It has a high collar. She is wearing a hat or bonnet or scarf tied at the chin. The man is wearing a ruffled shirt with cuffs that flare out of the sleeves. His pants are almost like knickers. He wears no hat. His shoes are black. His hair is lighter than hers. It is a sunny day. There is lots of green foliage. They are happy. There is something on the ground. There is some blue sky. I can see a little bit in the distance. There is a stone wall, maybe an outcropping. There is a structure in the distance. And the name of this painting, incidentally, I think it's by John Wyatt, a 19th century American painter. It's called Beekeeper John and Miss Margie. And I have to say that's darn close to 100% accurate, wouldn't you agree? So I thought to myself, well, okay, maybe it's a fluke. Let's try again. And the next week, we did another one. This was my target, and I told him again, this was precognitive. The target had not been selected at this time, but I had a target set, and I told him the target will be a postcard, and it will be a postcard of an outdoor scene. That's all he knew. And again, I'll read to you verbatim what he told me. He said, I see a house. It is multi-storied, 2 or 3 stories. There are peaked roofs. They are dark. There are chimneys. I see paned glass windows. There is grass in front. In fact, he said it's a row of houses. They are similar. The houses are white, yellow, green, blue, contrasting 2 colors. Then he said there's a bigger building behind, a city with skyscrapers, about 5 or 6. The buildings in front are pastoral. There is green. In the back, they are gray and brown. They are metal. There is lots of glass. The house is white with darker trim. They are elaborate, not quite Victorian. Maybe there is a small porch. It said it is a clear, sunny day. There are hills or mountains. I can kind of see a grid of streets form the layout of the buildings, but I cannot see the actual street. And then he said, you know, it looks like that well-known San Francisco postcard. Now I'm thinking to myself, what is there to train here? I had to, you know, if my idea earlier of a J-curve was correct, this kind of experience suggests there's a U-curve involved in training. The best we're going to be able to do with him is get him to maintain that level that he was already able to do without any training, without any hint that he ever had any of this ability. And I wonder if the people that Russell works with, the government monitors who came to SRI for 20 years, didn't perform kind of like this without any real training. They weren't trained, they were introduced to remote viewing. That's all it took. And in fact, I suspect that the less obtrusive the introduction, the simpler the introduction, the less baggage associated with it, the better. Of course, I had a doctoral dissertation to write, and it was published in 1980, and it came out twice as a book and a hardback in 1981, paperback in 1987. It's out of print now, but I want to talk to you a little bit about some of the things that I discovered in the course of doing that dissertation. I had to scrap my experiment because of the stacking effect problem, and I revised the dissertation as a complete overview, historical, popular, experimental overview of the whole field of psychic training. And it had basically 3 sections. I looked at pre-scientific traditions, yoga, shamanism, Buddhism, divination, Sufism, Judaism, ceremonial magic. Then I looked at dozens of popular systems, as well as the experimental data, hundreds of experiments, to see, are there any patterns here? One of the things that really intrigued me were the pre-scientific traditions. You know, in anthropology, there's a concept of folkways, which is if something lasts for generation after generation after generation, it must have some value. These systems in particular. What is there about them that has caused them to persist sometimes for thousands of years? And we might ask ourselves, also, with regard to these popular systems, how many of them do you think are going to be around 1,000 years from now? And what would be the difference? Now, I got very, very complex. I came up with about 60 different factors that each of these systems was attempting to modify. Some of them were intentionally attempting to train psychic abilities. Some of them were doing it as sort of a side effect of a spiritual training. In some instances, it was completely unintentional. Some of these systems, we discovered, didn't hold up under experimental scrutiny. One of them, for example, Silva mind control. Many studies were done to verify the Silva mind control claim that people taking those courses could do ESP. When I attended my first Parapsychological Association convention in 1973, 3 different studies were reported by 3 different researchers, including one, Milan Riesel, who was paid by Jose Silva to do the study. All of them got negative results. So I think we have to be especially mindful that you can have a situation where hundreds, thousands of people believe that they are taking a seminar program and learning how to do ESP, but even under the best of circumstances where the instructors themselves participate in the design of experiments to test that claim, the results turned out to falsify the hypothesis, or at least not support it. Now, at the time I did this survey back in 1980, I looked at about 160 different experimental reports having to do with hypnosis, yoga, meditation, relaxation, and feedback. And what the data then showed was that the strongest effect size were in the relaxation studies, particularly those reported by William Broad. You can see the effect size of 0.6. They're very, very strong results. But I was already aware of the work of Russell Targ, and I knew he was getting a comparable effect size, and he didn't even use relaxation. I thought to myself, isn't this amazing? Remote viewing has such an effective protocol. You can throw all of these other training protocols out the window. You get better results without any of them at all. Now, there are many different approaches to training. Pretty much in any field of endeavor, no matter what it is, training involves practice with feedback. And Charlie Tart, for example, wrote a book called Learning to Use ESP, in which he showed using the random number generator, if you try and try, if you have some talent to begin with, and then you try and try with a lot of feedback, within each session, your abilities will improve. But Charlie found, and other people subsequently found, that then every time you started a new session, you were back to ground zero. But there's much more to being involved in a training program. For those of you who are taking remote viewing training, I'm sure you know that in addition to the intellectual framework and the practice with feedback, you're part of a social support network. And I have to tell you, that's an awesome thing. Especially if you're involved in a religious, a spiritual context where there's a mythology. Contact with more experienced people seems to be especially important. And I think, in particular, of my dear late friend, Alan Vaughan. Excuse me. Alan was a great remote viewer and a great trainer of remote viewing abilities, and he was one of my teachers. And I know today at this conference, Pam Coronado is here, and Carolyn Koch is here, and Pam presented a paper by Alan about his work. He was scheduled to be here last year, but he was too ill, and he died last April. Alan was studied by Gertrude Schmeidler, the City College of New York, with a group of his students who he had trained to do remote viewing. And I guess she must have done the same kind of study that I did that didn't take into account the stacking effect properly. But it showed because she had all the students looking at the same target sets at the same time, which is not a good thing to do statistically, but it's an error that parapsychologists fell into occasionally. And most good research doesn't do that any longer. But in any case, what she found was amazing, and it is this, that when Alan got the correct target, so did his students. And sometimes Alan experienced a well-known problem in remote viewing called displacement. When Alan displaced onto the wrong target, but he described it with great accuracy so you could see this is not just chance coincidence, so did his students tend to do the same thing. And Gertrude said if this study is correct, it would suggest that Alan is opening up a kind of psychic doorway for his students to walk through, that they're tuning in telepathically to him. And all the spiritual literature about the student-teacher relationship suggests that it does take place at the telepathic level. For those of you who are training remote viewing abilities, this is something to be cognizant of. In a way, you could say it's almost a sacred relationship, a sacred responsibility. This isn't just a question of learning how to clean your rifle or following, a certain amount of technical procedures. This is a very intimate kind of a relationship. Now, we talk about analytical overlay as being the problem, that remote viewing training teaches people how to recognize and eliminate noise. Analytical overlay, emotional overlay, things like that. I have to say, I question that. I wonder if it isn't one of the myths that we have developed about remote viewing. And to cite as an authority to support my point of view, I might mention in 1996, I went to the Rhine Research Institute for their annual gathering, and the guest speaker was Joe McMoneagle. And he got up and he said, I think we have to rethink remote viewing. He said, we teach people that they have to avoid analytical overlay. He said, but my best viewings occur when I use my analytical overlay. It helps me to see the overview. It helps me to be even more correct. I wouldn't have done my best viewings without it. I wonder, should we have told Jeff Blank not to use his analytical overlay in those 2 descriptions of postcards? Would that have been of any help to him? I don't think so. In the field of psychic training, there's a lot of what I call pseudoscience. And by that, I don't mean it pejoratively. Maybe quasi-science would be a better word. What I mean is that people who are functioning at a psychic level need an intellectual explanation. It's hard for people to just say, I just did it, and take credit for it themselves. So they say, oh, it wasn't me, it was this astrology chart. It wasn't me, it was this dowsing rod. It wasn't me, it was the radionics machine or the Delaware machine. It wasn't me, I happened to have this special charm with a pyramid power on it, or I happen to have, there's an angel in a bottle who helps me. And from a pragmatic point of view, what we all have to say is, hey, if it works, use it, right? From a theoretical point of view, we can say, it's not a sound theory. We know better scientifically today. But the general popular field of psychic functioning works this way. And I think in a certain way, in the field of remote viewing, we have our own, it's much more subtle, but we have our own folklore. We have our own stories about how and why it works and what this is and why we're doing it. And they're necessary. We have to have an intellectual sense of what we're doing. But there may be a perception from which the things that we tell ourselves about remote viewing are just a more updated version of what people using charms and amulets and dowsing rods and astrology charts were telling themselves. And let me give you some examples. Sensory images are easier to perceive than letters and numbers. That's almost considered an axiom. And I thought it was true too until on one occasion I decided to use remote viewing, precognitive remote viewing on the stock market to determine exactly when the market would turn on a particular day, and I came within 1/100th of a decimal point of getting it correct. I think That's probably one of our myths. And it's strongly reinforced. Everybody comes together at a convention like this, and we repeat these truths to each other, and we nod and say, yes, that's my experience, that's your experience. It's what is known in the field of sociology and philosophy as socially defined reality. There's a lot of literature about it now. The field of postmodern deconstructionism is very good at sort of teasing these things apart and pulling them apart. How about this? The term remote viewing, I thought it was very interesting. In Hal and Russ's initial paper at the IEEE Journal, 1973 or so, if I remember correctly, they said, we've chosen the term remote viewing as a neutral term. It doesn't have the same baggage as clairvoyance, which means clear seeing, or extrasensory perception. Also, that's a term J.B. Rhine chose to be neutral, not to have any baggage. But viewing already implies something analogous to seeing, to using your eyes. And extrasensory perception is, frankly, it's a contradiction in terms. All perception is extrasensory. Perception is an internal mental process. It takes place after the sensory inputs occur, but the point of calling it extrasensory is to say this is a sixth sense, that there's something about remote viewing that is analogous to normal viewing. There's something about extrasensory perception that is analogous to normal perception. And so a term like, we've got to remove the noise and look at the signal-to-noise problem becomes a metaphor for thinking of it that way. We may be dealing with something radically different. In fact, let me submit that we are. The metaphor of viewing or sensory perception is useful only up to a point. And that's where I think we sometimes get into trouble. And that's where training programs that build upon those metaphors may run up against obstacles and walls. Amit Goswami says, and Edgar Mitchell seemed to imply as well in his talk last night, that maybe we should be thinking of consciousness as primary. When Russell Targ talks about non-local reality, what are we saying? I don't think we're saying that remote viewing is is akin to a sensory process. You don't perceive a distant object in remote viewing because of some kind of information flow from there to here. In a way, you perceive it because you are it. That's the message of the ancient yoga and Buddhist teachings, and of all mystical traditions. The oneness of consciousness is by virtue of that oneness that we have access to this information. And the reason it seems mysterious and paradoxical to us and hard to explain scientifically is simply because we start with the assumption that things are separate. And from that point of view, it seems to be a mystery. If we start with the assumption that consciousness is unitary, then the mystery is simply why we don't experience remote viewing more often. The Buddhists have an answer for that. They call it dukkha. It's something I alluded to a little earlier. It has to do with the craziness of life. That we live in a world filled with ignorance. Now, let me revert, though, back to the scientific question of, have we been able to demonstrate that any training programs work? And I want to show you now why we haven't and why we never will demonstrate that any program for training remote viewing works. A lot of the evidence that people have for a training program comes from anecdotal experience. You could say it's the one-shot case study, and in this diagram, the X represents the treatment, the training, followed by the O represents the observation. So if somebody says, oh, I went to a training program, and lo and behold, I did remote viewing. Therefore, the training works. Well, not necessarily so. It could be that you would have done the remote viewing without the training. Okay? That's pretty obvious. So scientific studies want to do at least what we call the one-group pre-test, post-test design. Let's test and then have the training and then test again. However, even if we do that, that's no guarantee that the training was the cause. After all, what if, for example, the first test was done at a time when local sidereal time was at about 18 hours, which is not conducive for remote viewing, and the second test was done at a time of local sidereal time, 13 hours and 30 minutes, which we now suspect is very conducive to remote viewing, the conditions would have changed. And that would be the reason why the second test showed greater results, having nothing to do with the training intervention. Or there might have been some other reason. So a simple pre-test, post-test is still insufficient to demonstrate that training actually occurred and was effective. Another way to do this then is to have a comparison. You can take one group that got the training and another group that didn't get the training and compare the two of them. Again, there's a problem. And this is not just in parapsychology, this is in all research in psychology that attempts to demonstrate the existence of training. This is an inadequate experimental design because the groups aren't randomized. You've got to know that these are two comparable groups that have to be selected randomly. So at this point, psychologists have said, well, what you really need, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back. Then there's another where we randomize. We randomize. The first group gets the training. We have an observation. We randomize. The second group does not get the training, and we have another observation there. There are still problems if we don't have a double blind, and it gets even more complicated. Researchers say, well, how do you know that the initial observation doesn't interact with the training, or that the initial measurement you make, like Russell's introducing people to remote viewing, wasn't really the most important thing, and the training had no effect at all? So ultimately, you need, in normal psychology research, the Solomon four-group design. And I can tell you that in the whole history of parapsychology, not a single study has been done using the Solomon four-group design where you compare the pre-testing with a group that doesn't have pre-testing to look at the potential results. And there's a good reason for it, not doing it. Because conventional psychology, which does everything it can through double blinds and triple blinds to eliminate the experimenter effect, has yet to find a method that will eliminate what we call the psi-experimenter effect. In parapsychology, if an experimenter has some psychic gifts and has a cherished outcome, a favored hypothesis, how do we know that they won't use their own psychic abilities to influence the results? The fact is, not only do we know there's no way to prevent against it, we have plenty of evidence to suggest that it does happen. Earlier, I pointed out to all the studies of William Broad that showed that relaxation is the best way to train, to induce psi. Well, what if it's simply the case that William Broad is an exceptionally gifted experimenter, and every study he does, regardless of the hypothesis, is going to get a good result like that, which happens to be the case. So it strikes me that there's a limit to the application of what is known as process-oriented methods in parapsychology research. Many scientists who are parapsychologists feel if we're going to be real scientists, we've got to use the scientific technique not just to prove that it exists, but to understand how and why it works. And then they come up against this problem, but they say, I don't want to be a shaman, I want to be a scientist, but I might be using my own psychic abilities to influence the data. I guess what I have to do is learn how to turn my psychic abilities off so I can be a good scientist. And to me, that's going about it backwards. What we need to do is not try to reduce the psychic abilities of the experimenter, but to amplify them. And let's not worry too much about proving experimentally, what is the best mechanism for training. What we have to focus on is getting the best results we can. Now, let me give you a little plug for the organization of which I am the president, the Intuition Network. There's our website. Our goal is to create a world in which everybody is encouraged to cultivate their own inner intuitive abilities. And we regard remote viewing as one example of an intuitive ability. And when remote viewing is being used wisely, lovingly, to create a better world for everybody, well, that's even more intuitive. For those of you who feel some kind of kinship with it, I happen to have pins with me, showing with the rainbow yin-yang logo of the Intuition Network. I regard it as the first major improvement on the yin-yang in 3,000 years. And you're welcome to come up and get a pin. I think I have several dozen, at least, for those of you who might like one. Our attitude towards cultivating intuition is very simple. Get together with your friends. Meet in small groups, encourage each other, love each other, share with each other what you know. You don't have to charge each other. You can do it for free. In fact, it works best that way. I'm very interested in practical applications when they're done with love, when they're done with a sense of responding to a real human need. And I'd like to cite, if I may, and I hope I don't embarrass her, a person who I regard as one of my heroes in this regard, Bevy Jagers. She is a person who heard I was giving this talk, and she said, Jeffrey, I understand you're going to talk about training remote viewing. And she said, I've even heard that you think training might not work, and I want you to know that I wouldn't be doing remote viewing if I hadn't been trained, because when I started, I had no abilities at all. And I got involved in training, and it's only because I worked tirelessly, effortlessly, very, very hard for months and months with the help of a teacher that with much struggle I was finally able to develop my abilities. And Bevy is known for going head-to-head with stockbrokers using her remote viewing abilities. And she trains people and works tirelessly and asking no money in return for what she does. And I said, well, Bevy, tell me more about your training. And she said, well, I had a teacher. And without her help, I wouldn't have been able to do anything. And she said, in fact, I wrote a poem to express my gratitude toward my teacher. And I thought, gee, could I see that poem? And she showed it to me. And I'd like to conclude my talk by reading to you some excerpts from her poem. You know, when you are so inspired by your teacher that you want to write a poem, that's love, that's passion, that's the essence of good training. And surely Bevy exemplifies that. So I thought we'd all benefit from getting a sense of what she wrote. Asher was the name of her friend, and she called the poem Asher's Eyes. A friend I had whose gaze was true and saw things opaque to me. So clear she saw with calm and grace, by all accounts, so effort-free. For years I'd lived and knew it not, this awesome fact of being blind. Yet in her pearls of wisdom gleamed a beacon of light that one might find. 'Twas not an envy seized my soul, nor led me deep in jealousy, but hunger surged within each breath, A yearning need enveloped me. No wish to take, but just to share and see just once with verity the unknown mysteries of what she viewed with richest clarity. And when I'd almost lost full hope and faltered on the upward bend, her beacon rayed me roundabout, richness showed her as true friend. Was it a word, a touch, a shove that helped me top that cruel hill? She led me through into the clear where vision opened, endless skill. 'Tis no strange gift she tendered me, but guided, helped, encouraged, led my stumbling steps in softer ways, while unseen scales of ignorance I shed. 'Tis but that we don't understand the majesty of humankind, and just what heights are held for us, hid within each fear-bound mind. And as a friend she gave to me much more than gently helping hand, that I would see and gain my eyes strong upon a pinnacle to stand. The climb was mine, my effort strong. Rewards unknown awaited me. But I am sure and know full well without her help, I'd still not see. Thank you.
Fine, we got time for some questions. Okay. We got some
And
questions
thanks to
or
Bevy.
anything of that?
Yes, I just wanted to know, you mentioned about, in one book, I think you said there was a chapter on the experiencing the living Christ. I wondered what book that was in.
The book is called Cosmic Voyage by Courtney Brown.
Thank you.
I'm new at this, and this may be a stupid question, but how do I determine sidereal time?
Called the Naval Observer Master Clock.
Yeah, there are ways to calculate it. There are computer programs available. You can check an astrological ephemeris or check with the Naval Observatory.
Yeah, I had that one right, didn't I?
Yeah.
See, I'm right about some things.
On the PK man, if you interviewed him personally, do you believe that he actually was given his powers by extraterrestrials?
The question is regarding my other book, The PK Man, and the answer is after 20 years, I'm still not sure.
I'm interested in the last point that you made about the relationship with the teacher. One of the things that the field of education has consistently said is that people learn the most based on their relationship with the teacher. And I'm just surprised that, I mean, I heard the strain through your speech, the effect of Alan Vaughan in the work that he did, that this hasn't been considered that strongly in the field of parapsychology as far as I know.
Let me refer back to Russell Targ's talk yesterday and his talk the year before. On both occasions, Russell repeated the phrase, and I know it had a great resonance in the group, reside in love. And I think it deserves repetition and an amplification, that we ought to think a lot about the ramifications of that as the foundation for what we're doing. When we come from a place of love, which I think the act of teaching ultimately is. You know, teachers, dedicated teachers and dedicated remote viewing teachers here aren't in it for the money. It's not about, you know, $8,000 for a training program or something. It's about wanting to share something precious with another human being. And when that's our motivation, when we're here because we love what we do and we love sharing it, and we love the people with whom we're sharing it, that, I think, is the basis of all real learning.
Jeffrey, I wanted to say thank you for all of your efforts as well that you do without charge and for people in bringing together people with intuitive gifts who are in the closet, who you allow to come out and play and who have been so damaged by society. And you have encouraged the gifts of intuition in this society so much that you're almost a household word connected to intuition. I really, really appreciate you, not just because you're my friend, and not just because of this, and giving what you've given to Bevy, which is really a treasure, but for what you've given to all of us on In Presence, and all of the other people whose lives you touch through all the things that you do. Thank you.
Okay.